500,000 people, whether Russian or Ukrainian, soldier or civilian, have perished in this needless conflict. $63 billion in damages, and 6.242 million refugees later, the war continues. Currently, Russian forces have been sitting on 18% of Ukrainian territory, and both countries are stuck in a war of attrition as the winter approaches. How long will this war last? And who will win? First, let's define what constitutes a Ukrainian victory. The Ukrainian army must have clearly defeated the Russian military. The Russian military must be defeated indefinitely, and Putin must acknowledge the defeat, so he won't just invade Ukraine 2 months later. However, to reach this, the US Congress and other nations must step up their support for Ukraine. With the current level of support, Ukraine has only been able to reach a stalemate. At the peak of this summer's offensive, Ukraine has only been able to advance a maximum of 90 meters per day, while Russia has expanded the size of its landmine fields from 120 meters to 500 meters in some areas. Also, let's talk about Ukraine's opponent, because from what we've seen, is Putin really going to give up that easily? If we learned anything from Putin's regime, it's that he won't take no for an answer, and he doubles down on his policies instead of trying something new. If the Russian people don't like the war, Putin just censors their freedom of speech. 4,000 Russians have already been arrested because of this as of December 2022. The Russian ruble has dropped 40% in value, and Russia's inflation rate is at a staggering 6%. Russia's GDP has dropped by 2%, and more than 300 billion euros belonging to the Russian central bank are frozen because of economic sanctions. But Putin has an alternative, and he turns to India and China, who are willing to buy Russian oil. Revenues from oil have actually been increasing. And even when Yevgeny Prigozhin brought the most significant threat to Putin's power in years, Putin swiftly disposed of him in a quote-unquote plane crash. If Trump is re-elected president, he will most certainly curtail funding for Ukraine. He has claimed, if elected, he will end the war in 24 hours. So this optimistic and somewhat naive scenario probably won't happen anytime soon. So let's talk about some more realistic scenarios. What about a treaty with Putin? In my opinion, that wouldn't work because it would project weakness. Calls for ceasefire are valid from the humanitarian perspective. And yes, we definitely do need to get supplies into Ukraine as soon as possible. However, we can still provide humanitarian aid while we still consider the long-term side effects. Ceding land to Russia sets a dangerous precedent in an increasingly weaponized world. Why can a nuclear state like Russia just bully a peaceful neighboring country and take away some of their land? A peace treaty at this stage in the conflict would be a gut punch to the US, NATO, its allies, and most importantly, Ukraine. Here's what I believe can solve this conflict: a security guarantee for Ukraine. If we allow Ukraine to join NATO, Putin will think twice before attacking an entire coalition of countries. While he has shown erratic behavior, his weakened army will most likely be defeated. In the words of a former Russian military commander who recently fled to Armenia, "I did not want to participate in this war. I wanted no part in the imperialistic habits of our ruler," he said, "but I do feel guilt in front of Ukraine. Guilt that I didn't do this earlier. I could have said no, I just didn't know what the consequences would be." The US alone already spends more on war, $877 billion, than the next 10 countries on the list, including Russia, combined. NATO has 3.6 million active personnel compared to Russia's 1.33 million active personnel. NATO has 20,633 military aircraft compared to Russia's 4,182. NATO has 2,151 military ships compared to Russia's 598. Also, Putin's excuse for this entire invasion is to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. It was to prevent NATO from furthering expanding its influence and territory. He said, "There will be no winners," describing a hypothetical future in which Ukraine has joined NATO and then attempted to invade Russian-occupied Crimea. And you will find yourself drawn into this conflict against your will. You will be fulfilling Article 5 in a heartbeat, even before you know it. If Ukraine can join NATO, it would already be a win. Entry into NATO is an absolute must, because any other resolution to this conflict will just invite a second invasion from Putin. Their country has been ravaged by war, and NATO will finally be able to bring peace to the region. The fundamental concept of NATO is to maintain peace and stability. And right now, the US, the UK, and France don't need peace. We're not being invaded, but we have a moral duty to help out those who are stuck in war. NATO says it is committed to the peaceful resolution of disputes. As we previously mentioned, the time bomb is ticking, and Ukraine is running out of funding. People around the world are being dragged into other international conflicts, such as the current conflict in Israel. The 2024 US election is coming up, but most importantly, we have the people who continue to die in Ukraine daily. The worst thing we can do is inaction, and we cannot sit around and hope that the Ukrainian military can miraculously break through Putin's fortified positions. The reality was acknowledged by the commander-in-chief of Kiev's military. Just like in the First World War, we have reached a level of technology that puts us into a stalemate, he said in an interview with The Economist, while in a related essay, he added that the war, after nearly 21 months of fighting, is gradually moving to a positional form. Putin's also making calculations as well. In 2024, we will have an 82-year-old run for President of the United States, and Trump has already been indicted on multiple alleged crimes damaging his reputation, but he's still dominating the polls in the Republican Party. Trump leads 45% compared to Biden's 41% in the most recent polling in battleground states. Does Putin believe Trump will win? Is he waiting this war out until Trump wins so Ukraine will be cut off from support by the US? Historical wars show that prolonged conflicts like this one are eventually solved by a definitive defeat of one side, and this war is no different. The Second World War was fought because the First World War failed to help the defeated nations from falling into extremism. The American Civil War only ended when the Confederate States ceased to exist, and the ultimate result of the Napoleonic Wars wasn't determined after not one, not two, not three, but 7 separate wars. It ended only when Napoleon was exiled to a faraway island 1,162 miles away from land. Recent findings suggest that there has been a 9% increase in Russians who are openly opposed to the war. In total, about 20% of the population support the war, and 20% of the population oppose the war. The majority of the Russian people's opinions remain undecided and unclear. Russia has completely censored the true amount of Russian casualties, so much of the Russian population doesn't know of the true extent of Russia's military failures. This neutral 50% of the population doesn't know about the true number of Russian casualties, but there is increased suspicion given current global events. At the end of all of this, either Ukraine will cease to exist, or Putin will be out of power. There is no other alternative. Putin does not have the political capital to just surrender and withdraw. And it's clear and obvious who deserves to survive. Again, this war can't end right now, because the Russian army is still in Ukrainian territory. The Russian army should be expelled, and Ukraine should have control up to its pre-2014 borders. And if the war were to end today, then Putin will win, because he already gobbled up large parts of Ukraine. And keep in mind that Russia still controls 18% of Ukrainian territory. If you want to talk about economic concerns, the West has boatloads of money to give out, specifically the US. The US currently spends a little over 0.25% per share of GDP to Ukraine. While this number may seem significant, this ranks below countries like Lithuania, Slovakia, and Bulgaria, who have far weaker economic power. The US spending on military only fuels the flames of tension, as we are spending over $61.1 billion on modernizing aircraft, just aircraft, not the Army or anything else, for the fiscal year of 2023. Instead of using those funds to continue to militarize, which causes more bloody global conflicts, we can use the money to end conflicts, not increase our capability to kill more people. Governments around the world have insisted the military demands more funding than other sectors of our society, so we can't divert the money to help with our domestic problems like many people believe. And a ceasefire won't solve any issue, and it's not a formal resolution of hostilities. Why would a piece of paper stop Putin from invading again? He doesn't care about the Ukrainian people, and his political situation is fragile right now. He can't withdraw because that's the evil person he has defined himself to be. This is a war that will largely be decided by each side's allies. How much is the West willing to commit or not commit? Both countries have invested the past 2 years into defeating each other. And the result of the fighting is this. We can't hope that something will change the outcome of the war. We are the ones that have to bring about the change. However, on the Ukrainian side, their current counterattack has delivered an underwhelming amount of success. If they want more funding soon, they would have to win a few more battles. They have to prove themselves in a situation where the literal existence of their country depends on it. I believe Ukraine should try one more major counterattack in addition to the current one to show determination and strength as this conflict ages. It will help their pitch to Western countries for funding. Ukraine needs to be impulsive and not be afraid to take this fight to Russia. Russia has just been sitting back and defending for the past few months, and this position is way too comfortable for Russia. Again, Putin's strategy is to wait until Ukraine runs out of food, ammo, or international support. Another political reason for sending more funding to Ukraine is China. China is on the brink of invading Taiwan, and pressure is on the Chinese government to act as Taiwan develops closer ties with the US. A few days ago, China sent 43 planes and 7 ships into Taiwanese waters. If we don't stand firm with Russia, that will give a green light to China. The last thing we would want is a crisis in Europe and Asia. Step 1, we send one final package of funding to Ukraine. This can come from the US or NATO. It's just anything to jumpstart a major counterattack by Ukraine. Russia's military has littered their conquered lands with landmines, and it will take every ounce of support from the West to break Putin's lines. Cracks and rifts are appearing among the Russian soldiers themselves. According to the US government, Russia has begun executing its own soldiers who are retreating from the front lines. They don't want to fight and be ordered to massacre innocent people. It's no secret that this isn't the special operation Putin told them it was. Putin's firm grasp on power in Russia is weakening. The Russian people don't want war. One Russian who was detained during the crackdown has said, "In Russia, people are detained for just wanting peace, and I don't think it's a crime to want peace." Some of the Russian oligarchs don't want war. Oleg Tinkov, a banking tycoon worth over $3.5 billion, recently wrote on Instagram, "I don't see any beneficiary of this crazy war." And the Wagner mutiny was almost successful. In 24 hours, the mercenary marched from the southern port city of Rostov-on-Don to just 57 miles south of Moscow. The question is, will the West give Ukraine a chance at survival? Or will it just leave the cub to fend for itself in the jungle? People say we need to improve our country first, but the Ukrainian people are just as equal as humans as you and I. The Ukrainian government can't take care of them because the country is being invaded. And when somebody is hurt, and when somebody is asking for help, we must be the good Samaritan to help. This is how society should function aside from politics. This war should not end on stalemate terms. Putin has committed atrocious war crimes, and he cannot just walk away free because the rest of the world is scared of him. The ICC has issued an arrest warrant against him, saying that Mr. Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, is allegedly responsible for the war crime of the unlawful deportation of population children, and that of unlawful transfer of population, also children, from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. And yes, nuclear weapons, of course, are dangerous. But if we don't draw the line right now, when do we? China can threaten Taiwan with nukes, and India and Pakistan relations are souring, and North Korea is in a never-ending war with South Korea, and Israel has recently declared war on Hamas. Nuclear weapons should not be used in this form to threaten countries. Russia's nuclear arsenal adds complexity to this situation, and it's important to remember Russian interests should also be taken into account. If the mighty Russian army, as previously hailed by Putin, is defeated to an inferior Ukrainian army, Russia may spiral into chaos. The Russian people will ask some serious questions of their leaders, because the war has drenched the Russian economy and negatively affected and impacted the lives of millions of Russians. From history, the fall of Germany after World War I led to even worse violence during World War II. Therefore, for this war to end, Putin can no longer remain in power. With every loss on the battlefield, he inches closer to using nuclear weapons. He has shown complete disregard for morals throughout this conflict, and we can certainly not trust him with weapons of mass destruction. Putin has already shown signs of discontent as he has suspended Russia's participation in the New START treaty, which was aimed at limiting nuclear weapons, and he has begun to build tactical nuclear weapon storage facilities in neighboring Belarus. And China represents a wild card in negotiations, but we can use their influence and connection with Russia to talk Russia into a peace deal. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has stated all countries deserve respect for their sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that support should be given to all efforts that are conducive to peacefully resolving the crisis. The moral argument is important as well. Are we really going to continue letting the bad guy continue committing crimes? Inaction would be the equivalence of the police idling standing by during a robbery. In the end, it's all about giving one final push of support to Ukraine. Power comes from the majority of the people, and if there is enough discontent in Russia, it is possible to kick out the all-powerful Vladimir Putin from power. A different leader will probably be more open to negotiations and government reform in Russia. Russia is weak, but Putin knows NATO doesn't know that. NATO is scared when it needs to be showing strength against evil. Let's talk about the United States' recent track record as well. Besides Ukraine, other countries still remember our disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Other countries still remember the 13 American servicemen who died and the $7 billion of weapons we left abandoned in the hands of the Taliban. What happened to the United States being the strongest country in the world? Are we still the beacon of democracy? Ukraine and Russia don't need to evolve into the next North Korea and South Korea. However, our foreign policy is sending Ukraine in the wrong direction. We've actually been able to help out other nations in the past and achieve results, like in Kosovo and Iraq. Kosovo, NATO stepped in to preserve independence for Kosovo and to help bring an end to violence. And if you're still not convinced, then at least acknowledge the fight and the resilience of the Ukrainian people. From day one, Putin had already lost the war. I vividly remember the morning of February 24th, waking up to news reports of airstrikes and urban warfare. I was horrified and terrified because the prospect of World War III became more and more legitimate. I was terrified, although I was thousands of miles away from the war zone. And I'm sure all of you watching felt scared at some point as well. But imagine what it would be like if you weren't thousands of miles away. Instead, it was only a few miles. Now, imagine that amplified amount of fear, because that's what the Ukrainian people had to deal with in the first few days of the war. However,
The Ukrainian people fought back. From makeshift bombs, from bottles of vodka, to building tank traps to regular everyday people joining the army, the Ukrainian people have remained resilient. That's exactly what Putin never saw coming. The fact is, it would be impossible for Putin to. This is exactly like the US and Vietnam and Afghanistan. And it was always impossible to win because you would have to eliminate everyone. The West knows Russia won't win, but they are not sure yet if Ukraine can win. Therefore, as our society continues to debate its next course of action in this conflict, the clock still ticks. Were Russia to win this war, that would be a tremendous victory for all forces that oppose democracy, for all people who are planning to use violence of one kind or another to overthrow democracies, according to historian Timothy Snyder. The biggest counterclaim to my statements is that we don't want American troops to be involved and killed in a foreign war. But if Ukraine can be admitted to NATO, the diplomatic war will be won. Putin will not have the political capital nor the military capital needed to invade all of NATO. So therefore, I urge the US to continue to provide funding to Ukraine and a guarantee future entry into NATO. It's now or it's never.